microanalytic research that looks at the role of facial recognition, facial matching between a caregiver in the development of self-regulation or affect regulation, which is overlaps, but it's clearly slightly different from what you're talking about in the development of an infant or of a child, because it suggests, in my mind, a slightly different, not different, but that there is an influence in the relationship that has a profound effect on the development of physiological responding and self-regulation.
Absolutely. And actually what you're addressing, does everyone understand or hear, because it's noisy, everyone heard the question? Okay. So one is, and there's a tape that you can contact David Silver, who just finished the DVD of the last presentation, in which it just happens that my presentation was on child developmental, is that the one that was before? Okay. There's a tape from the Institute for Ergonomic Science in November, which has my presentation on a melding or a unifying of the work of Reich, John Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth, and Daniel Stern, which covers a lot of these issues. And I teach a course at the New School on attachment and on child research and child development. So I know this work very well. In fact, what you're raising is fascinating questions which Reich never had the chance fully to explore, which in the establishment of the Institute for the Study, the ORIC, the Ergonomic Infant Research group, the hope of looking at how that relationship between mother and child rearing. Certainly Reich and Neal, based on the quote, and many quotes similar by Reich, would believe that it is in that central face-to-face interpersonal relationship between the mother, the primary caregiver, and the child would emerge the processes in which self-regulatory behaviors become organized. Now, the problem and the classic conundrum is that if the adult or the society, through their adults, is armored and structured in such a way, that's to some extent what's going to be organized. So Margaret Mead, for instance, did fascinating studies of Balinese mothers and children, in which, considering the fact that Bali is this Pacific, very, very, low impact society, it has a high rate of violence among adults, very brutal violence. Fascinating. People are always shocked to discover that. But she did these she and Gregory Bateson did these it's a book, it's an astounding photographic book. I don't think it's in print anymore. Of Balinese mothers and children, in which what she pointed out was that they nurse for long periods of time, so it sounds self-regulatory. It's wonderful. Long-term, on-demand nursing, all that's in place. But yet the children are disconnected from the mothers, and they were trying to figure out why. It had nothing to do with Reich particularly, but from an anthropological perspective. And what they noticed is that mothers nurse, but what they do when they're nursing is they turn away from the baby as the baby is nursing. It's a constant dynamic that's repeatedly, it's embedded in the culture. And it produces a very, very particular response and a very particular organization of the child's early development. So these kinds of things become suggestive. Then we have no definitive, evidence, but certainly things like the organization of facial response and facial recognition, and eye tracking processes and various kinds of physiological responses in nursing and in early childhood interaction in infancy definitely suggest that this is the place in which the organism becomes regulated and in which self-regulatory processes become organized. And that becomes central to explaining a lot of what Freud was trying to deal with, as well as what Reich, I think, moved ahead on in terms of understanding how much more complicated biologically this was. Is that it?
Just mention that all of these sort of sub-functions in Reich's work fall under a general thing he called contact, which he defined very specifically and is absolutely essential, not only in therapy, but in understanding human interaction in general, and I think self-regulation in particular. Development.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Unless you want to...
I think there was one... Did someone else have?
I just
Oh,
wonder
yeah.
what's stormed against in that. Is it the
What?
obvious, in the quote from Neil, you said children should not be stormed?
Yeah, I think that was a Scottish. I think that was a very Scottish way of saying yelled at and intimidated and attacked.
So I'm puzzled at this stuff about being at ease and exactly what you meant. when you said
You're always very particular whenever I say things like that. You understand? It's very good. No, that's good.
Next time I promise not to listen.
No.
You make it ill at ease.
No,
Is
he's being a good.
ease compatible with raging? Is being at ease compatible with ecstasy? In other words, what were you trying to get at when you talked about being at ease?
At ease would mean the easy flow of all of these processes. So it wouldn't. That's a very good question, because the implication, certainly in the post 1960s kind of bliss, a new age bliss thing, to think that ease means like, oh yeah, man, peace. I mean by the use of the term ease, the organism free to function and follow in the sense that when I look at a weather system, it's at ease. It's not always nice or pleasant, or sometimes it's rageful. A tornado is part of the natural. I mean, maybe the term is an ill-used term, an ill-advised term because of its implications. Just as Reich felt towards the end that his big mistake was using the word sex. Even though he had a very specific meaning for it, it was just one of those words that could not play out freely or at ease in the society.
Uninhibited. With the opposite of being at ease, being controlling,
rigid.
Being
rigid. I mean, their Reich is their Reich open. I think that maybe that's actually I'll stand corrected. Maybe rather than at ease, open, that the system be open.
And then just a very small point. What's too small?
That's always what you start with, but it turns out to be
Two small points. Neil underwent psychotherapy with Homer Lane.
Yes, that's right. That's correct. That's correct. He was. That was his first analysis. That's right.
And B, what Lane established and what Neil did at Summerhill with the community voting is not an example of what Reich means by work democracy.
Well, you would be the expert on that, right?
Reich is very opposed to equating democracy with voting.
Right.
He thinks that that's a mistake.
Right.
And indeed, well, that's
right. Well, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, and this Dr. Bennett can address more in greater detail and with greater expertise. Reich in the letters is very clear. Neil keeps always talking about, self-governance and voting and the kids doing this and that. And Reich says, that's okay. But what about self-regulation? And Neil keeps coming back to the issue of self-regulation as, that's interesting. I'll work on that. I'm working on that with the kids. Neil did therapy too, sort of. Did orgone therapy, child therapy with children, although Reich kept pushing him to do more of it. Neil kept saying, maybe, or some of it works. I'm not really that good at it. You're better at it than me. So there was a clear divide there in terms of their interest. But I think you stand absolutely correct in pointing that out. That self-governance was not an inherent part of what Reich certainly thought of as work democracy. Although Dr. Bennett is doing extensive work as to exactly what Reich meant by work democracy, which is not always as simple as we would think. Some of that is because, of course, Reich never had time to finish and fully develop a lot of these threads. Anyone else?
You said Summerhill is still in existence?
Yes. Yeah. Constantly under attack.
Who goes there now?
Who goes there?
Still criminals and...
No. Actually, even when Neil took it over, it didn't really follow quite the model that Lane had. It was usually Neil's greatest complaint was that it was usually the children of the rich who have been thrown out of every private school in England. Now it's a I don't know the actual population. It tends to.
Well, we were there. Yeah. We were a couple of years ago on sabbatical, and they get a lot of international students now. Actually, Japanese.
Yeah.
Is
And
it
part of
small?
this.
How big is the population of students?
Small.
Yeah. It varies in size, and it's always been a problem in terms of, Neil complained, and I imagine they still do, that they had a hard time always finding staff, because they had limited budget, and also limited ability of people who really understood. His daughter's the director, who interestingly, while he was alive, and while the school was refused to have anything to do, she ran a horse farm down the road, something. She stayed close to him, but she wanted nothing to do with the school. And the mother took it over, his last wife, and ran it until then the daughter took it over. It's periodically, up until about, I think, 7 or 8 years ago, it was under attack. The government keeps trying to find ways to close it down, and they keep finding ways to. But interestingly, in a number of studies that have been done over the years, looking at the result, the big issue always Neil was asked was, how do your students do compared to other students? And Neil always would say, was very clever. He would say, they all do great. They become good truck drivers. Some of them become good farmers. Some of them become, I don't care. When they were asking how many become doctors and lawyers. And one of the studies that was done of following through on students is that the success rate, if you measure success rate in terms of remaining stable, going on, establishing professions, getting, a high degree of success in the professions they chose, was extremely high compared to the rates in other schools. So, and this was done by actually the guy who, I don't quite ever understand this, the guy who wrote this biography of Neil, who doesn't like Neil, and definitely doesn't like Wright. What's his name?